Hey, welcome back to the channel, Beyond Man Forsooth. Today I'll be continuing our conversation from last time, which is from Friedrich Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil. And what I want to point out here is that it's section 262 from the final chapter in the book, or final section in the book, What is Noble? And there are questions of what it means to live beyond man. Because quintessential to Nietzsche's philosophy, his not metaphysics, not idealism, but his realism, his accounting of history, his standpoints and perspectivism, right? Not relativism, because no one actually holds or lives by relativistic standards. They live by cultural standards, which are political and economic, and aka religious standards, meaning a way of life. So that's what people are always fighting and arguing over. And when it comes to fighting or arguing, this is why we say things like stop resisting. What do you mean you're disagreeing? What do you mean you're arguing? How could you argue? How could you disagree? So Nietzsche's discussing what it means to live beyond man. And that means living beyond the old morality. And what he's saying is that when a culture or a people or classes of individuals coalesce to create a systematized way of life that is larger than a cultural or a tribal context, meaning for for a civilization to establish itself beyond just small family units, it has to establish a state. And in the process of doing this, there occur these spans in our history where the same means and ways that brought us forward in time then break down in between technology and social organization, and how it's all powered by human labor to begin with as its root source of energy, so to speak. Um, it then becomes a question of, once you reach those tipping points, once you reach those breaking points, now your existence hangs over the abyss. And this is why Nietzsche says, what is seeing if not seeing abysses? And this is the kind of thing a lot of people don't want to see, because they want to take the good but not the bad. They say, oh, civilization is so good, but how could things be so bad? And it's like, well, because they only grow together. They only come together, right? So to even reach a beyond point is to be witness to the destruction and to even take part in it. As I mentioned in the first video, it's one thing to say observing an experiment changes the outcome. Well, then you better believe every single ego on the planet participating in the experiment also changes the outcome, right? The illusion is that history stopped happening, is that no more can happen, because that would push us over the edge to the end of history, right? It's a weird stance when you realize what the human endeavor has been when it comes to power and resource exploitation and the like. But that's not what we're getting at here. It's not about the morality of it, even though Nietzsche, it's the one line of development where man actually grows. Everything else is theory, everything else is hypothesis. Things like potentiality and the idealism of the perfect forms, like all these things have, to anyone who's been paying attention, it's fallen away. In fact, by dint of our light speed culture, where we can see humanity unfolding in real time, we can see what they're really like, we can see their behavior en masse by the millions and billions. And then with the historic sense, it's studying them to be predictably so. So when Nietzsche says living beyond the old morality, he just means, well, once upon a time that would have been in the West Christianity. But eventually we hit that tipping point, and the Western world blew up in cataclysm in World War I and World War II, right? And then these old forms of organizing at a smaller scale gave way to organizing at a larger scale. Same thing happened with warfare and the advent of the nuclear bomb, right? There's all these events that happen, but it's the in-between spaces when all is in flux, right? When the planks and railings are in constant flux. The reality is they always have been. Culture is the thing that says, no, but we have a safe space here. We have a stable bearing and foundation upon which we can build, which is generally habit and technology. So historically speaking, though, when what worked yesterday no longer works for today or then tomorrow, that's when things break down. So to give you an example, This is also from modernity or recent history, the last 100 years. And this comes from Herman Hess in his novel Steppenwolf. And in it, he's writing about the main character. So it's a fictional account of reality, but the character's saying the so-called horrors of the Middle Ages, these horrors were really non-existent. A man of the Middle Ages would detest the whole mode of our present day of life as something far more than horrible, far more than barbarous. Every age, every culture, every custom and tradition has its own character, its own weaknesses, and its own strength, its beauties and its ugliness. It accepts certain sufferings as a matter of course, right? Things you can't do anything about, things that, no one can stop or change. And it puts up patiently with certain evils. Why? Well, when you have no other option, what else does anyone ever do, right? You learn to laugh, really. So, human life is reduced to real suffering, to hell, only when two ages, two cultures, and religions overlap. See, now we're at the going beyond. Now we're at that bridge over the abyss. Now we're going, oh, those same means and ways that pushed us forward, they no longer suit not just the psyche of a people, but the real physical, social, and technological organization. It becomes a total mess. It becomes, and usually it leads to generally plague, famine, war, right? Rebellion, destruction, all that stuff. It all goes hand in hand. So he's talking about the in-between space as well. And if you know when Hess was writing, this was right between World War I and World War II. And he does talk about hearing the beatings of the war drum and all that. But that's what he's talking about. When two cultures, two ages, when two religions overlap. This was Nietzsche saying in Schopenhauer's Educator when he says, we're still barely out of the Middle Ages. The ice flows are piling up and there's going to be a cataclysm coming and a big crashing of all these, what has the appearance of events, happenings, great things and great men, when in reality, fate and inevitability is another word for it. And, this in-between space is what Hess is describing. So a man of the classical age who had to live in medieval times would suffocate miserably just as a savage does in the midst of our civilization. Now there are times when a whole generation is caught in this way between two ages, two modes of life. See, there we go, two generations, or a whole generation caught between two ages, two modes of life. This is what I meant in the first video when I said we are at an unprecedented stage of living beyond the old morality and the old ways of life. So going on, he says, with the consequence that it loses all power to understand itself and has no standard, no security, no simple acquiescence. Naturally, no simple answer, no closure, no light at the end of the tunnel, no retirement plan is another way of putting it, no future. How could you build for the future or plan for the future if you don't even know what the future is, right? You begin to see the problems from a very real, just a simple human perspective of like having a family, raising children, investing in the right. How do you even do that when things are changing so abruptly? So it loses all power to understand itself. That's the people themselves. And look at our time, right? Never before have so many people believed so many insane and crazy things. And I mean, America has a history of this, is like, as the carny descendants of Europe who moved over here, a couple hundred years ago, it's all like the excess and the people seeking freedom and liberty, and practice of free religion. You can see that there's been a proliferation of not just untruth, but lies and marketing, and everyone finding their niche to sell their products, right? A lot of nonsense is sold in there too. Um, but it's a consequence of the time and the age. It's like no one could have stopped it. No one could have contained it. At most, as with any historical force, you can mitigate it, right? But there's no actually stopping or containing it. So naturally, everyone does not feel this equally strongly. A nature such as Nietzsche's had to suffer our present ills more than a generation in advance. What he had to go through alone misunderstood, thousands suffer today. Again, that's Herman Hess from his novel Steppenwolf. And thinking about it now, it's like, okay, well, what does that translate to today? Hundreds of thousands, millions suffering the same today? And I don't want it to sound like all bad news, but this is the difference of, if you just want to have a simple or earnest conversation about real life and human suffering and what that entails in modernity, a lot of people right away, they just don't want to hear it. Right away, they hear bad news. And it's like, well, is it really bad news? Or if it's just the way things are and you're the one who doesn't want to look at it, or who can't bear to look at it, or who can't understand to look at it, where does the problem lie then? Right? Because you're dealing with subjects who don't even want to acknowledge their reality. Um, and yes, of course, we could discuss and go backwards and say the human spirit is a conceptual hallucination. So whether I'm listening or reading, the theory is that it doesn't matter. I could hear it or I could see it. But no matter what, I'm misinterpreting something in theory, or I'm interpreting something anew. See, what Nietzsche had said, what Nietzsche pointed out, and what he held the gate open for, the almost the one saving grace in this is he says, what, the past does need to be abandoned to every generation who comes anew, and everything that came before has to be interpreted anew. This is philosophy post Hegel. This is religion and spirituality post-death of the Western God. Notice that I note Western God because the Eastern God has its own history and its own people, and us Westerners can't presume to speak for billions of other people who are not us, because pretty sure Westerners are borderline, if not like at least in terms of the upper ends of civilization, they are the smallest minority on the planet, right? So it's no small thing to draw these distinctions and understand that our perceptions and our beliefs and our ideals are not universal as is. Never mind that our own people don't even believe in them in a cynical and nihilistic age. But kind of moving on with the thoughts here, it is the human contradiction. As a friend of mine once said, Quinn, the one who is least satisfied posits the furthest goal. That's Nietzsche drawing his arrow back with his conception of the Superman and what that entails. But, the juxtaposition is, that, hey, to exist in the human world is to be civilized, is to be pleasant. It's culture as safe space. It's culture as reserving the time and energy for manners, for graces. It's table settings. It's using the right silverware. It's all these little things that you could say, well, the world's on fire. We don't have time for these things. Yet this is what civilization established to begin with. So the very urgency created by the human endeavor or inherent to it was the same thing that fuels it, which is the same thing that builds out its excesses or its going beyonds to the point of destruction. And that historically, what we learned is that it's unstoppable. Therefore, you couldn't educate against it. But the Platonic and Christian theory is that you can stop or change it, when in reality, to stop or change any one thing is to change everything. So this is why, clearly, with beings and becoming, it's constant flux in organization and reorganization. We also discussed this in Peter Sloterdijik's book, Infinite Mobilization. But, moving on with, I actually have those excerpts here. And this is Peter in his book. And what he was saying is, what was claimed at the beginning of the book on modernity, that it represents the paradoxical program to carry out an infinite project on a finite basis, can now be said about history as a whole, insofar as it proceeds in an anthropogenic exodus, as a utopian way home and an apocalyptic mobilization. The history-making tension between the design and the foundation, between the driving and the persisting, is not only based on the non-relationship between the infinite and the finite, oblivion, I guess, the utopian and the topical. Far more powerfully effective in it is the act of confusing the memory of an intrauterine, acosmically blessed existence with the anticipation of an extrauterine, worldly, real, universal happiness. So we were going to fall, like with the Christian theory, we were going to fall out of grace and then fall back into it, right? In the historical ontological phantasm of the self-illuminating not yet, right, that better tomorrow, as an acosmic past is projected onto a cosmic future, the intrauterine dowry is hallucinated as an outer defiant world, right? The great super other. From a protest or political standpoint, it's the father you're going to argue with for more rights, more goodies, more payout. No, dad, fuck you, dad, I don't want to go to work. Fuck you, dad, pay me more. Those kinds of things. But he goes on. But then history can be nothing other than the endless birth struggle of a phantasmagorical human body that is abandoned by the inner motherly homeland and exposed to non-motherly foreignness, right? You stare at the abyss and it stares back at you. You can look at the mirror, but when the mirror cracks, you will recognize then that you were an other all along. And only in your own pretend and or vanity did you fool yourself into thinking, oh, you're a human being and it's a perfectly normal position upon which to be positioned. No other animal has to deal with this. They would no doubt find it problematic too. So, and I say that from the perspective of we run into problems with other animals, not our species, all the time. It's part of our history and our being. We also put them to work for us, just like the human body. But moving on here, there it has to throw itself into the enterprise of turning the foreign into a home, right? The body. But the foreign never quite wants to be the same as that which is our own home, as our own and our home, because the acosmic cannot be realized in the cosmic. Basically, it's like he's saying from that animistic perspective of, hey, we're putting our projections on the world. Actually, our projections don't hold, and they dissolve before our bodies even dissolve. The moment you can lay something onto the world, it's already changing. So, that was the Western quest for permanence, because worldless limbo is never the result of worldwide effort. The historic departure towards the realization of the real home must be an extermination campaign against the immediately present cosmic outers, others. So the very posing of an ideal is being against reality, is what he's saying. The matricide undertaken to exhort a return to the womb is the logical and objective consequence of this world historical directive of the experimentum mundi. Right, so that was the theory, right? That something was going to work out, that something was going to turn out good, that we'd get our paradise pre or post apocalypse, right? Whereas in Human All Too Human, Nietzsche writes, every belief in the value and worthiness of life rests upon defective thinking. Oh shit, that's not even about purpose or story or narrative. That's just the belief about value and worthiness in life. So even from that perspective, it's a very deflationary and stripped down take. And then again, you can try, this is where the desperation of the living beyond period comes to the fore, where you see people just hungry for tomorrow that's not coming, haunted by all the promised tomorrows that are by now yesterdays that also aren't coming, right? So you're haunted not just by what didn't happen, but also the belief in what could have happened, right? But then when I said to change anything is to change everything, well, again, things get messy. So now Nietzsche poses the Superman, and when he does that, he goes against men as they are. When I say, what does it mean, beyond man, forsooth? What does that mean, beyond man, forsooth? It means to be different and better beings than what we already are, meaning we don't stop here. We are neither that animal stretched on that tightrope, nor are we that jester jumping over him and winding up foaming at the gates outside the city, right? Those are all possibilities, but that wasn't a desired outcome or goal. So he doesn't turn against the world in favor of a heaven or some other reality or some other reinterpretation of the old ideals. He wants a better human reality. He wants, very simply, a better human being. And how do you describe that better, higher human being of what he describes, right? Because for all this seeming, when we talk about modernity and post-modernity, how they mean the same thing, how they go hand in hand. One's almost the upside down or the shadow realm of the other, right? That they exist interlocked even within, arguably, within the end of time dialectic, which I could call the Hegelian dialectic. It was the idea that this was progressing somewhere. Also the idea that there was a master who doled out purpose, meaning, and pay, and also the illusion that there was a slave who was going to have his day in the sun or something, right? These are all fictions. These are all grand narratives that fall apart in reality. So again, it's not ideal. It's simple. You need better people for a better reality. And what kind of men? Well, we've discussed this in Human All Too Human before. So I'm going to begin with, this is aphorism 39 from Human All Too Human, the fable of discretionary freedom. The history of the feelings on the basis which we make everyone responsible, hence the so-called moral feelings, is traceable in the following leading phases. At first, single actions are termed good or bad without any reference to their motive, but solely because of the utilitarian or prejudicial consequences they have for the community. So the first ape to put a piece of straw down an ant hole, that was good because that was a improvement upon technology and food, right? Because all technology relates back to food. So at first, single actions, in time, however, the origin of these designations is forgotten, but it is imagined that the action in itself, without reference to its consequences, contains the property good or bad, with the same air according to which language designates the stone itself as hardness, the tree itself as greenness, for the reason, therefore, that what is a consequence is comprehended as a cause. Accordingly, the goodness or badness is incorporated into the motive of any deed by itself is regarded as morally ambiguous. A step further is taken, and the prediction good or bad is no longer made of the particular motives, but of the entire nature of a man, out of which motive grows as grow the plants out of the soil. Thus, man is successively made responsible for his particular acts, then for his course of conduct, then for his motives, and finally for his nature, right? So hand in hand with freedom and irresponsibility went a continual foisting back on of law, barrier, regulations. No, you are responsible for yourself. You must contain yourself. You must behave yourself. You must be tamed and trained, right, to be a good, cog or actor or whatever the role is. So now at last it is discovered that this nature even cannot be responsible inasmuch as only and wholly a necessary consequence and is synthesized out of the elements and influence of past and present things. Therefore, that man is to be made responsible for nothing, neither for his nature nor his motives, nor his course of conduct, nor his particular acts. So there, Nietzsche just undid this because it was an error to begin with. By this process is gained the knowledge that the history of moral estimates is a history of error, of the error of responsibility, as is whatever rests upon the error of the freedom of the will. Schopenhauer concluded just the other way. Thus, since certain actions bring depression, consciousness of guilt, in their train, there must then exist responsibility, for there would be no basis for this depression at hand if all man's affairs did not follow their course of necessity as they do. Indeed, according to the opinion of the philosopher, follow their course. But man himself, subject to the same necessity, would be just the man that he is, which Schopenhauer denies. Right, remember, because this is existing upon positing an alternative reality where reality is not what it is. Right, this is what's so seductive about theory and criticism and critique and critical theory. And I say this with consideration that Nietzsche is the progenitor and originator of all this in higher history and modern philosophy, right? But the fact that we read that. Freedom, therefore, to be thus and so, not to act thus and so. Out of the S, the sphere of freedom and responsibility follows, according to his opinion, the a priori, the spheres of invariable causation, necessity, and irresponsibility. This depression, indeed, is due apparently to the a priori, insofar as it is to be delusive, but in truth to whatever S is to be the deed of a free will, the basic cause of the existence of an individual. In order to let man become whatever he, by the way, you following along? This is really simple stuff. Come on, guys. Because whatever he wills to become, his to will wollen must precede his existence. Here, apart from the absurdity of the statement just made, there is drawn the wrong inference that the fact of the depression explains its character, the rational admissibility of it. From such a wrong inference does Schopenhauer first come to his right. He's saying people. It's like it'd be like saying someone's responsible for their mental illness. No, it's the like I said with the mirror cracking. They're recognizing there is no you without the surface of reflection, right? Where else do you place the projection to even draw the inference? This is what made our way of life brilliant because you could just, if not medicate people, either way, you push it back on them. And it really is throwing people out to sea, is what it is. Wrong inference, the fact of depression explains its character, rational instability of it. From such wrong inference is Schopenhauer first to his fantastic consequent of the so-called discretionary freedom. For the origin of this fabulous entity, Plato and Kant are equally responsible, but depression after the fact does not need to be rational. Indeed, it is certainly not so at all, for it rests upon the erroneous assumption that the act need not necessarily have come to pass. So an act happening is just as powerful as an act not happening. How can you even make sense of that? You can't, but it does weigh down the human mind. Therefore, only because man deems himself, it also, real quick, I was going to say, it explains the obsession with history and rewriting history and culture. And it's not that people don't have a right to do it, it's that the very mania and obsession that all of it's valid is telling, and that there's an obsession, therefore, is telling. So, therefore, only because man deems himself free, but not because he is free, does he experience remorse on the stings of conscience. Well, why weren't you all the things that you thought you could have been? Well, it was just a thought. It's not really a big deal, is it? Moreover, this depression is something, right? This goes back to the top, if you remember, the history of the feelings on the basis of which we make everyone responsible, hence the so-called moral feelings, is traceable in the following leading phases. So that's what we're doing here. We're tracing this, right? If modernity has a character, it's not just haunted, it's depressed. This is also, I mentioned this before, it's easy to take for granted when people talk about amor fati and Nietzsche's life affirmation, but the world of Zarathustra is not, it's not a, it's not a world that any sane person would find hospitable or homely or welcoming to them. It's a hostile and alien world. Um, so, going on, moreover, this depression is something that can be grown out of. In many men, it is not present at all as a consequence of acts which inspire it in many other men. It is a very varying thing, and one closely connected with the development of custom and civilization, and perhaps manifest only during a relatively brief period of the world's history. No one is responsible for his acts. So, huh, that's fascinating because he's basically positing, okay, we've had 10,000 years of pre-civilization, 2,000 years of modern civilization, Christian civilization, and he's saying potentially a higher, better future, a smarter, intelligent species would recognize that we're just dumb animals. Most of us really are. We're really simple animals and we don't have a lot of thoughts in our heads, right? We're not particularly hopeful for the future. They're not there's not, right? People don't have anything coming to them, right? We've been playing these games a long time. And he's pointing out that maybe people will only be held responsible for this brief period in time. Now, this sounds mentioned like post-capitalist realism, right? If it's hard to imagine life without capitalism, imagine life without moral judgment and consequence, and a belief even in it that people can be held responsible for their feelings and mental states, and the fact that history has programmed them to be traumatized, insane animals who believe the most nonsensical things, right? So he's positing a more enlightened humanity. Anyway, going on, no one is responsible for his acts, no one for his nature. To judge is tantamount to being unjust. There you go. Nietzsche says, who's going to throw the first stone? And everyone in the world says, we've been doing it for all of time. Look at all the bodies piled up. Uh, so this applies as well when the individual judges himself. The proposition is as clear as sunlight, and yet here everyone prefers to go back to darkness and untruth for fear of the consequences. Right, if you tell yourself you could have been more, you don't have to face the fact that you're not. Maybe that's how that goes. So damned if you don't, damned if you don't. 107, non-responsibility and non-guilt. This is following up in Human All Too Human, because remember, this is a psychological work. Again, it's not metaphysical, it's not idealistic, it's not pessimistic either, but this sort of material does seem to have that effect on people. And I think it speaks to the modern psyche that it's just not well equipped or prepared to deal with reality in the modern world. So 107, non-responsibility and non-guilt. And this is one of my favorites because Nietzsche concretizes his meaning. It's not, again, what does beyond the old morality mean? What does beyond man mean? What is the Superman? How do you create a Superman? He tells you right here. The absolute irresponsibility of man for his acts and his nature is the bitterest drop in the cup of him who has knowledge. Why? Well, because it tells you our whole history was wrong, because we thought with enough coercion, with enough propaganda, with enough manipulation, with enough education, we could stop the disaster, we could prevent apocalypse, and we could finally teach these dumb animals how to be civilized, how to sit at a table, how not to pee on the toilet seat, right? Anyway, if if he be accustomed to behold in responsibility and duty the patent of nobility of his human nature, all his estimates, preferences, dislikes are thus made worthless and false. His deepest sentiment, with which he honored the sufferer, the hero, sprang from an error. He may no longer praise, no longer blame, for it is irrational to blame and praise nature and necessity, right? That we've just been doing what we had to. Just as he cherishes the beautiful work of art but does not praise it, it is incapable of doing anything for itself. Just as he stands in the presence of plants, he must stand in the presence of human conduct, his own included, right? Facing up to who and what we are or are not. He may admire strength, beauty, capacity therein, but he can discern no merit. The chemical process and the conflict of the elements, the ordeal of the invalid who strives for convalescence, are no more merits than the soul struggles and extremities in which one is torn this way and that way by contending motives until one finally decides in favor of the strongest, as the phrase has it, although in fact it is the strongest motive that decides for us. Hey, look, I cleaned up the place. Well, it's about time you were the one who messed it up, right? All these motives, however, whatever fine names we may give them, have grown from the same roots in which we believe the baneful poison lurks. Between good and bad actions there is no difference in kind, but at most in degree. Good acts are sublimated evil. Bad acts are degraded, imbruted good. Right? From weakness comes strength, from ignorance comes knowledge. The very longing of the individual for self-gratification, together with the fear of being deprived of it, or its opportunity, obtain satisfaction in all circumstances. Begins to sound like will, and will to power. Let the individual act as he may, that is, as he must, be it in deeds of vanity, revenge, pleasure, utility, badness, cunning, be it in deeds of self-sacrifice, sympathy, or knowledge. The degrees of rational capacity determine the direction in which his longing impels. Every society, every individual has constantly present a comparative classification of benefits in accordance with which conduct is determined and others are judged. Right. It's like, why do we have the term truth? Because we see telling the truth as a good thing. Why do we have the term liar? Is it because liars shouldn't exist? No, it's because liars do exist. So we have a word to designate what these things do and don't mean. So, but the standard perpetually changes. Many acts are called bad that are only stupid, because the degree of intelligence that decided for them was low. Right, and most of what we do today was things we were doing 10,000 years ago. So the bar has stayed very low, because all of civilization is meant to cater to the average, the mediocre. Go figure that collapse is inevitable when everything must cater to the lowest common denominator and the return to the mean. And the mean is standing back up after you fall down again, right? The human endeavor. So many acts are called bad that are only stupid because the degree of intelligence that decided for them was low. Indeed, in a certain sense, all acts now are stupid, right? Because this was all just necessity. And now that everyone's running in place and running to get nowhere real fast, you can kind of sit back and go, oh, like our ancestors, they could have only dreamed of our utopian modern day life, you know? But this standard changes. Oh, we read that. So intelligence has yet been, so for the highest degree of human intelligence that has yet been attained will in time most certainly be surpassed, right? Beyond man, forsooth. Highest degree of human intelligence has been attained, be surpassed. In retrospection, all our present conduct and opinion will appear as narrow and petty as we now deem the conduct and opinion of savage people and ages. Remember, that's what we were talking about earlier with Herman Hess. Those people in the Middle Ages, right? They would have found our way of life barbarous, just as we find their mindsets narrow, right? If you read their manuscripts. Um, and their perception on the world, just like anyone from back then who would try to even discern the modern psyche, would see it as probably schizoid, crazy, demonic, evil, backwards, confused. It really begins to sound like Gnostic Christianity, which eventually was hammered into what we know as historic Christianity, where evil is the principle of the world, and hence God needs to destroy it to begin with, right? That Satan is just as universal and important as a figure as God himself. Again, to the people of the future, we will appear narrow, petty, dumb, as we deem the conduct and opinion of savage peoples and ages. To perceive all these things may occasion profound pain, but there is nevertheless a consolation. Such pains are birth pains, because it's recognizing what we are working towards, what we are building towards. And Nietzsche's very confident in his ability to think, because he narrows it down to one axis. He says man has one route of evolution, but we'll get to that. Their birth pains. The butterfly insists upon breaking through the cocoon. He presses through it, tears it to pieces, only to be blinded and confused by the strange light, by the realm of liberty, by such men as are capable of this sadness. How few there are, right? Most people just aren't that sensitive, or they don't think that hard. Will the first attempt be made to see if humanity may convert itself from a thing of morality to a thing of wisdom, right? The sun of a new gospel sheds its first. So, in this regard, if I said, if one side of the spectrum is stupidity, the other one is intelligence, and if on one side is strength and the other weakness, then Nietzsche puts morality on one side and wisdom on the other. The sun of a new gospel sheds its first ray upon the loftiest height in the souls of those few, right? And through the ages, there's only been a handful of people we remember for their, like, what they actually taught, what they actually wrote down. The sun, but the clouds are massed there too, right? Right. That's what helped create them too. Thicker than ever, and not far apart are the brightest sunlight and the deepest gloom. Everything is necessity, so says the new knowledge. And this knowledge itself is necessity. All is guiltlessness, and knowledge is the way into insight and guiltlessness. If pleasure, egoism, vanity be necessary to attest the moral phenomenon in their richest blooms, the instinct for truth and accuracy of knowledge, if delusion and confusion of the imagination were the only means whereby mankind could gradually lift itself up to this degree of self-enlightenment and self-emancipation, who would venture to disparage the means? He's saying if suffering is the way, well, fan-friggin-tastic, right? That's good news. Why do people balk? Why do because again, it sounds sexy, right? Ooh, the Superman, beyond man, beyond the old morals. And then you recognize, oh, what do you have to do? You just have to sacrifice everything. It's like the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. It turns out it requires like the blood of billions over time. Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. That's what the human endeavor has been. Sacrifice, blood labor, blood money, right? So who would have the right to feel sad if made aware of the goal to which these paths lead? So Nietzsche is saying there is a goal here. What is it then? Everything in the domain of ethic is evolved, changeable, tottering. All things flow. It is true, but all things are also in the stream to their goal. He's saying it's already in motion. This is what I mean about to accept one thing is to accept everything. To refuse one thing is to refuse everything. But it's all changing all the time anyway. What does it matter? Right? Zarathustra also asked that. He proposes there's a lot to unlearn from the past, but there's a lot to laugh about too. So, one goal. Though within us the hereditary habit of erroneous judgment, love, hate may ever be dominant, right? The madness of millennium, as he calls it, and the irrationality of millennium breaks out in us, as he says. Yet under the influence of awakening knowledge, it will ever become weaker, right? Those old habits will become weaker. Look, it only took a couple thousand years, and maybe even tens of thousands of years before that. So maybe if we exist for a couple thousand more and a couple tens of thousands more, we'll form new and better habits, be a wiser, happier species. So a new habit, that of understanding, not loving, not hating, looking from above, grows up within us gradually and in the same soil, and may perhaps in thousands of years be powerful enough to endow mankind with capacity to develop the wise, guiltless man, conscious of guiltlessness, right? So he's denoting that he's aware of this guiltlessness. So it's not just that something's absent, it's that it's self-contained or irrelevant even, I suppose. It's hard to fathom in a world whose entire human existence predicates itself on justice and suffering and pain, right? This is like, because they are such intense experiences and because our history is so rife with them, it's no wonder that they take up the foreground and the background and, become the whole goal of history in both religion and secular society, right? We want a more moral or just world, as the liberals tend to say, right? But Nietzsche's saying, all that's the window dressing. That doesn't matter. None of that stuff matters. None of what these present people are saying. He calls them superfluous. Honestly, he calls modern people superfluous. He says all these millions, billions, hundreds of thousands, we're all superfluous, right? Why? Well, because when you're interchangeable cogs in a meaningless nihilistic death machine whose sole purpose is control and power, with no actual love or care for humans and human values, and the whole thing's disposable and to no real end or purpose, what are you left with? Well, Nietzsche says in this process, there is something folding and unfolding, and that is, in thousands of years, be powerful enough to endow mankind with capacity to develop the wise, guiltless man, conscious of guiltlessness, as unfailingly as it now develops the unwise, irrational, guilt-conscious man. That is to say, the necessary higher step, not the opposite of it. So see, Nietzsche, this is how Nietzsche is affirming our modernity in our life. He saw it before anyone else existed to see it, right? And he affirmed it before it happened. He saw it as necessary rather than trying to fight the historic forces, rather than saying, hey, we need to go backwards. Hey, we can stay here in stasis. We can pretend this is reality forever, right? No, Nietzsche sees it as this history in all its ugliness, in all its genocide, in all its building of prisons and the medications in medicating millions and billions of people stupid and silly with all sorts of bad drugs. Nietzsche sees this whole modern existence as a higher step, not the opposite of it. So when people say we're digressing, we're devolving, no, their perception is retrograde, is what it is. They still believe in yesteryear's ideals. They didn't hear about the death of God, you could say. So the whole thing was an error. Sloterdijk relates it here. So this is about the theory of education, Whig history, liberal progress. The question of the learning ability of our species touches on a critical point. This is, by the way, from Infinite Mobilization. Humanity is a priori learning impaired, right? So before the fact, it's learning impaired because it is not a subject, but an aggregate, right? It's a fiction. When we speak of humanity, we are creating a general term that can only haunt speculative sentences in the form of an allegorical subject. Right, and nowadays in postmodernity, the subject is gone. Like, we're dealing with a subjectless humanity. Who is anyone even talking to? It's everybody and nobody, right? Nietzsche saw that ahead of time too. Sentences that the Age of Enlightenment made carefree use of. What appears to be a crisis of Enlightenment universalism today is in fact a transition from the study of humanistic allegories of the species to that of a hard ecology of local intelligences. This ecology begins only after the completed insight that humanity has no self, no intellectual coherence, no reliable organ of wakefulness, no self-reflection capable of learning, no identity-building common memory. Right, at most you can, seeing is seeing abysses, and seeing too many and seeing them clearly is seeing yourself out, which is learning to be a good actor with everyone else, or you scare and confuse them, right? Like the madman in the marketplace. So that is why humanity cannot be wiser than a single human being. Indeed, even as a whole, it cannot become as wise as an individual who has learned the hard way. The aggregate we call humanity has no body of its own with which to learn the hard way, no hand by which to learn firsthand, right? Like a hand on the hot stove, but rather a foreign body, the other, its place of residence, the earth which does not become wise but transforms the other change into a desert. The classic model of learning from harm collapses before this fact, right? So the idea that we can educate, that we can teach wisdom or virtue, collapses before this fact. All future learning processes at the level of the species will be fraught with an almost intractable problem of transmission. The question of how acquired and embodied intelligence can be so it also speaks to the AI problem, right? Can be transferred from one who has become wise to the unwise. More generally speaking, how individual insights can be incorporated into social institutions and technical systems. Only individuals can be wise. Institutions are well designed at best. The third remark concerns itself not with the subjectlessness of humanity, but with the subjectlessness of disaster, right? To recognize a disaster, you'd have to recognize your part in it or how it affects you. Otherwise, you just don't care. If I may use this manner of speaking, our everyday understanding shows an inkling of this when it follows its usual habit of interpreting great disasters in a fantastic way. We think of fatality under the schema of the anonymous event. In contrast, it is crucial for disaster didactics to view even the most massive disaster under the schema of personal action, right? You're not going to prevent the going beyond. It's already happened. It's happening now. Disaster as event does not have the same grammar as disaster as action. Of the first we say, it happened, it fell upon us. On the second, someone did it. Someone let it get to that point. It is only when the disaster has a subject, you could say a culprit, that it makes sense to interpret it as a stimulus for self-critical relearning in order for learning to become possible after disasters. A subject must be assumed that sees the disaster as their own and refers to it as their own deed. So you apply that to our model of the Superman, of recognizing responsibility, but seeing no fault or nothing to be sad about therein, right? It's life as it ever was. So this is saying, you can't educate it, you can't legislate it. There's no political or cultural activity that actually fixes this. But that's been the illusion all along, that these were institutions that prevented the very things they prescribed to fix, versus that's just the business model, profiting off of people as a factory farmed animal, no different than how we used to put oxen on the machines and plow the fields. Now it's just human labor. Increasingly, robots, technology, and artificial intelligence. Sloterdijik goes on, only disasters that are committed by someone can form this arc of reflection which confronts the perpetrator with themselves while bypassing the event. See, people don't want to be fully human. They don't even want to recognize the results of their actions. They don't even want to recognize the parts they play. How could you be human if you didn't recognize how you affect others in the world, right? It sounds kind of like, to me, being a dumb animal, right? To be unaware of how you affect the other animals around you. That sounds like the definition of an animal to me, right? So what's the difference between an animal and a human? A human actually concerns themselves with affects, not just effects. But effects don't matter because there's no stopping them. Affects are what you can actually control for. That's environment, that's mood, that's feeling, including good feeling or good vibes. So it is only disaster as action that creates this recourse, which presents the seemingly impersonal calamity to a particular subject as their previously hidden true reality. That's the immanence of it all, manifesting itself inseparable from the event in which the truth is revealed, right? It's the oblivion. Understanding the disaster, therefore, means setting in motion a kind of Oedipal investigation. Only insofar as the disaster that happened is an indirect crime does the investigation expect metanoia, rethinking, and repentance from an unconscious or hybrid perpetrator, right? That basically one feels themselves to be a criminal therein, and thus is haunted and hunted. Thus here, as in any thinking, right, and that's opposite to what Nietzsche was saying, this is a necessary step in higher history to create wise, guiltless men. So thus here, in any thinking that judges morally, both the interpretation of the event as deed and the identifying of a culprit are indispensable. So basically, it's just owning up to the crime. This is what the madman said, right? How could we ever live up to the deed that we've committed? I think Nietzsche would argue thus far we haven't reached it, but he would say we are on that interim step, and it's necessary as everything else has been necessary. So, I was thinking that decadence is as much a historic and necessary force as virtue and idealism itself. There's a push of history, cause and effect, and there's the pull of the attractor or the imminent other, which at any point in time is known as God or the ideal future or whatever it is that human beings, whatever better world they thought they were creating or getting to, that was the pull that we thought we were going to arrive. But like there, it was as much of a belief in escape and fleeing into time. It's really not that complicated, but I think Christianity in the Western world, especially with the TV and internet, really retarded the species in serious ways. And that is the point, that everything at the end of the day is as it should be. These processes and forces were selected for as a consequence of a global scale civilization of human beings all working in an impossible sort of harmony to maintain any kind of balance at all. There's something unnatural in the way that everything is forced, yet there's something absolutely natural to the eros of the situation that draws people and forces together into time and belief and into the future to begin with, right? The very what you could say is the birth of a people in the first place, right, was the belief in a future, that we have a home here, right, and that we have a future here, versus living in the in-between times, as we've been discussing, living in the beyond the old morality times. That's standing out over the abyss, and that is a precipice of the destruction over the destruction. So um, this was created, this was selected for, this was called for, this was all designed. Look at everything in the world that's human and see that it was designed. And then from the questions there, like he says, it's only questions of degrees. How well designed, you know. Back to the main point of living beyond, Nietzsche says that is the one line of development, that we steadily repeat that process. And that's what we've been learning from, is our own destruction, our own self-sacrifice. So it goes in one direction in one axis. And notice again, it's not logical. It's not actually logical, and it's not even moral. It's feeling based. It's not rational. Oh, that's what I was thinking of, Kant's instrumental rationality. That whether it's that or even Jung's brilliant depth psychology, is that for the free spirits today and in the future, it's on them to find out anyway. No one else is going to stop them, or no one else is going to tell them to do it or stop them from doing it. So not logical, not rational, but it is moral. So there is a bridging of understanding, and a modern nihilistic Western world, it's not just a state of psychological nihilism. It's that when the nihilism has been realized, that now becomes the soil from which the clean conscious must develop and extricate itself. So none of these things disappeared simply because secular society can't stand to look at its own schizoid, non-existent self, in this non-existent theoretical mirror, what we call hyperreality in media. Rather, the critiques in all institutions, media or otherwise, have only been made to serve these self-same functions. It's all just a perpetuation of the machine. So in this regard, I was going to say, it sounds like modern man's condition is total domination and slavery in a way that the old gods and kings would have never even imagined themselves. If you told them that their way of life was going to be changed to be thus, they couldn't have imagined all the paperwork, all the construction, all the bodies that went into building these large irrational systems, right? Because they have rational ends in mind, but like I've said before, once you get into traffic, once you see how irrational people behave and how irrational the outcomes are in the destruction, but that's back to the point of being okay with it, that yes, all of culture is an oxymoron insofar as it's a repression of death, but that the end comes for everything, be it individuals or whole entire societies, beliefs, and ways of life. I hope I've made clear here that Nietzsche's idea of going beyond the old moralities and going beyond man, these aren't like theories. These aren't ideals. These are a more Thucydidean based psychological observation of beings in time, beings becoming in time, or flux over stasis, right? The idea that for there to be human life, there must be a degree of stability. Stability means control, control means stasis, which is mistaken for permanence. But I think all of human life is learning to let go, in the sense that there's nothing so big or nothing so important, whether it's a single human body or a whole network of them, there's nothing so big that it doesn't fail or die. And I understand that that probably sounds negative, but I think all of modernity and the modern market has made itself so appealing and powerful by the very denial of the reality of eros and death, and that not just that uh, things and people die, but that what we love and what we cherish and what we think is most important, including human values themselves, also change and die, right? And that man himself changes and dies, and that man himself is actually very moldable, very easy to change, very easy to manipulate. This is why advertising replaced poetry and marketing replaced church and religion, right? Why the state replaced church and religion? Why? Because it's, in terms of the feeling, the affect, the import of human involvement with the world and one's place there, and that all these things, it's a place to house the body and the mind, right? That the culture, that just like the house houses the body, the culture, the mindset, the psychology houses the mind, the psyche, the individual who believes himself to be real, just as they believe their culture to be real. What I've said about culture is that really it's programming for children. It's not like, through all of history, you didn't need to count on getting people to buy in and pay in for 70 years at a stretch. Most people didn't live that long, right? Today, I think most people don't live that long, and maybe we're heading back towards that direction, because we are seeing a regression. It's like I talked about with McLuhan's laws of media, that four things happen. Things are enhanced, things are changed, things are obsolete, things are brought in new. Go figure that in the creation of civilization, or simulations for breeding, right? Go figure that eventually problems would happen, or problems would arise, or that there's no actual containing the process in total, because there's too many outliers, there's too many questions, too many unknowns, too many variables. The very idea that you could know enough to control the world is funny, let alone to actually the idea that you could control humanity and the world is even funnier, right? So it's coming to terms with reality that humanity has the hardest to do. And through all history, you can see that the church, the state, all these power structures, they existed to manage the individual's existential despair and dread and problems. It was all sublimated. It had a place, right? It found its home in religion. It's found its home in whatever a culture's belief system and structure was. In the Western world, I think just what you see is hemorrhage. You see belief and idealism and insanity and paranoia. You see these things just hemorrhaging all over the place, everywhere, because we've opened ourselves up to it. It went hand in hand with this idea of believing in progress and freedom. We had to clear the ground for letting all these things out of humanity to create all this power. But then it turns out, once you open the floodgates, turns out it would be much harder to close them again, if, like Pandora's box, if it can be even said that you can put anything back in. The one thing that remained inside was hope, and hope is evil. Why? It's because hope is the thing that tells you something here might change. And I said changing one thing is changing everything. Again, thanks for checking out the channel. I'm Zach Markowski. This is Sharper Pen Image Consulting. If it's not a little bit more simple, I hope it's at least a little bit more clear what Nietzsche means when he says to live beyond man, to live beyond morality, to live beyond an age. All right, that's our reality. Anyway, I hope I catch you on the next one. Like, share, subscribe, share this with people you think might appreciate it, and I'll see you later. Take care. Thanks. Bye.